Hello, lovely. Settle in, your story is waiting.
The needle moved through fabric like water. Elara Hartwick's fingers were stained with thread, deep crimsons and golds that wouldn't wash out, no matter how much she scrubbed. Her mother had tried to discourage the stains. Her father had tried to redirect her talents toward a respectable marriage. Her sister Serafina had tried, with increasing venom, to convince her that needlework was beneath their station. But Elara's hands had a language all their own. It was late morning in the atelier, the small workshop she'd carved out in the back rooms of her family's Belgravia townhouse. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above bolts of the finest fabrics money could acquire. Silk from Lyon, wool from Scotland, lace from Brussels, so delicate it looked like frozen breath. Everywhere there was beauty. Everywhere there was potential. And in Elara's hands, that potential was being transformed. The dress on the mannequin before her was a masterpiece in progress, a deep emerald silk gown with gold cording that traced the bodice like captured lightning. The design was bold, architectural, nothing like the insipid pastels her mother preferred or the garish, over-decorated pieces that currently dominated London's fashionable drawing rooms. This was a dress for a woman who knew her own power. Elara had been commissioned to create it 3 weeks ago by Lady Margaret Whitmore, a widow of considerable means and even more considerable taste. Lady Margaret had come to the atelier after hearing whispers about the Hartwick girl who could make fabric do impossible things, create movement from stillness, drama from simplicity, art from mere thread and cloth. "I don't want to look pretty," Lady Margaret had said, settling into the velvet chair across from Elara's workspace. "I've done pretty for 40 years. I want to look magnificent." Elara understood. She always understood. It was the reason women came to her, though they rarely told her family exactly why. In a society that wanted women to be ornamental, safe, decorative, Elara made clothes that whispered rebellion. Her stitches spoke of power. Her design suggested independence. Subscribe for original, handcrafted love stories that help you relax and restore. Every narrative is uniquely created, never recycled, always heartfelt. The dress for Lady Margaret was nearly complete. The skirt remained, a complex feat of engineering that required the hem to fall in perfect, precise pleats that would create movement without compromising the silhouette. It was the kind of challenge that made Elara's heart race. She had been working since dawn. The gold cording was finished, each stitch placed with the precision of someone who had spent years learning to make her hands do exactly what her mind envisioned. The bodice fit perfectly, the low neckline sophisticated and flattering. The waist fitted so precisely it seemed impossible that any woman could actually breathe while wearing it. They could. Elara always ensured they could. But the skirt was where genius lived or died. Elara was so absorbed in her work that she almost didn't hear the commotion downstairs, almost didn't register the sound of her sister's voice, sharper than usual, pitched higher, with an edge of excitement that Elara had learned to recognize as dangerous. Almost. But something made her look up. Something made her set down her needle and listen. Serafina was home early from her social call. Serafina Hartwick was beautiful in the way that required constant maintenance. She was 2 years older than Elara, which meant she'd been working for 3 years longer at being precisely what society demanded: accomplished, attractive, amenable. She played the piano adequately. She danced adequately. She smiled adequately. Everything about her was adequate, which in their world meant everything about her was perfect. Everything, that is, except her sister's talent. Serafina had never sewn a straight seam in her life. She'd tried, once, when they were children. The thread had tangled, the fabric had bunched, and she'd thrown down the needle in frustration and never picked it up again. But she had eyes. She could see what Elara created, and she could see how people looked at her sister's work, with admiration, with wonder, with a recognition of genuine talent that Serafina herself would never receive for anything she attempted. It had been festering for years. The jealousy had taken root early and grown like something poisonous, twisting around her heart, poisoning her thoughts. And now, finally, she had found her opportunity. The Grand Patron's Gala was the most prestigious event of the season, an invitation-only evening where the most wealthy, most powerful, most influential families of London gathered. It was the kind of event where one appearance in the right gown could define a woman's entire season. The right gown could catch the right eye. The right eye could lead to the right marriage. Serafina had received an invitation. She had also received no commission from any dressmaker of note because she had delayed making a decision that had paralyzed her into inaction. But Elara had created a gown for the gala, not on commission, for herself. It was a creation she'd been designing for months in secret, something that went beyond anything she'd made for a client. It was a dress that was entirely, unapologetically Elara. Deep sapphire silk, bold silver threading, a silhouette that was daring enough to be scandalous, but structured enough to be utterly appropriate. It was a dress that would make her unforgettable. Elara had kept it hidden in a locked trunk in her atelier, telling no one except her closest confidant, her lady's maid, Rose. She had told no one in the family because she knew exactly what would happen. Her mother would say it was too bold. Her father would express concern about her attracting the wrong sort of attention. And Serafina would do something. Serafina always did something. But Elara had miscalculated just how much something Serafina would do. On this particular afternoon in late March, Serafina entered the atelier without knocking. This alone was unusual. Serafina never came to Elara's workspace. She made a point of not coming to Elara's workspace. But today, she came. "I need your assistance with something," Serafina said, her voice carefully pleasant. "A small personal matter. Could you help me find my good gloves? I think you borrowed them last week." It was a lie. Serafina never lent Elara anything, but the excuse gave her a reason to be there, to search through drawers, to open cabinets, to move around the workshop with a purpose. And Elara, distracted by the dress on the mannequin and the work still to be done, barely noticed. She pointed vaguely toward a cupboard and turned back to her sewing. It was the last thing she did before her world shifted on its axis. The sound that came next was the sound of the locked trunk being opened. Not locked, Elara realized with a surge of horror, because the key had been sitting on her work table. The sound was soft, careful, deliberate. Elara's head snapped around just in time to see her sister lifting the sapphire gown from the trunk. "What are you doing?" The words came out as a whisper. Serafina held the gown up to the light, and for a moment, just a moment, Elara saw her sister's face register the truth. This dress was magnificent. This dress was the kind of gown that would make the woman wearing it unforgettable. "What I should have done months ago," Serafina said simply. She folded the dress over her arm with surprising care, turned, and walked out of the workshop. Elara stood frozen, her needle still in her hand, unable to process what she'd just witnessed. By the time her mind caught up with what had happened, her feet were already moving. The townhouse was 3 floors. Elara took the stairs 2 at a time, her skirts tangling around, her unbound hair coming loose from its pins. "Serafina!" she shouted. "Serafina, stop!" Her sister was already at the front door, already calling for the carriage that apparently had been arranged in advance. This wasn't an impulse. This was planned. Serafina had come to the atelier with intention. "You can't take that," Elara said, reaching the bottom of the stairs, breathless. "That's mine. That's for the gala." "Not anymore," Serafina said. And there was something in her voice that Elara had never heard before. Not anger, not jealousy, but a cold certainty. "I'm borrowing it, for tonight, and then I'm selling it." "What?" "Mrs. Edith Pembroke has been looking for a gown for her daughter," Serafina continued, stepping into the carriage with perfect poise. "She's willing to pay an extraordinary sum for something truly exceptional. I heard about her through the Ashworths. She's visiting London for exactly 1 week. Serafina, you cannot—" "I can," Serafina said, "and I am. Consider it payment for all the years I've had to watch you play at being an artist while I've had to be an actual lady." The carriage door closed. Elara stood on the front steps of her family's townhouse, in her working day dress, her hair undone, her hands shaking, and watched her sister's carriage disappear into the London traffic. For a moment, she simply stood there, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but feel the weight of what had just happened. Then something broke inside her. It wasn't rage, though that came too. It was something deeper, a refusal, a fundamental, absolute refusal to let this be the end of her story. Serafina could steal a dress, but she couldn't steal Elara's talent. She couldn't steal her hands. She couldn't steal her vision. Elara grabbed her shawl and ran. She didn't stop to tell her mother. She didn't wait for proper shoes. She simply ran after the carriage, her feet hitting the pavement in her house slippers, her shawl flying behind her like a banner of desperation. The London streets were crowded with afternoon traffic, carriages and carts and horses and pedestrians all moving in different directions. Elara pushed through them, following the direction Serafina's carriage had gone, calling her sister's name even though it was useless, even though her voice was being swallowed by the city. She was so focused on the disappearing carriage that she didn't see the horse. She was so consumed by what had been taken from her that she didn't notice the merchant's wagon pulling out from a side street. She was so desperate to catch up that she stepped directly into its path. The driver shouted a warning. The horse reared. The wagon lurched. Elara's feet tangled in her skirts. She fell. The pavement came up to meet her with shocking force. Her hands flew out to catch herself and scraped against the rough stone. Her knee struck hard. Her shoulder hit the street with an impact that drove the breath from her lungs. For a moment, the world spun. The London sky above her was suddenly too bright, too vivid, too real. She had failed. Her sister had taken everything, and Elara had fallen trying to stop her. And then, a shadow fell across her face. A hand appeared in her line of vision, reaching down, offering help. The hand that helped Elara to her feet belonged to a man in formal morning dress, well-tailored, expensive, bearing the unmistakable marks of nobility. His eyes were dark and impossibly calm, and his expression showed genuine concern rather than the social politeness she might have expected. "Are you hurt?" he asked, steadying her as her legs threatened to give way. That single question, and the complete sincerity behind it, changed everything. His name was Lord Alaric Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne, and he had stopped his carriage for a woman falling into the street because something in his chest had simply refused to let her fall alone. This was not his habit. Alaric had learned, over 32 years, that the world operated on distance and duty. You attended events. You performed your role. You did not become involved in the personal dramas of strangers, no matter how compelling those dramas might appear. But something about this woman, her desperation, her complete disregard for propriety, the way she had been chasing a carriage with her hair undone and her feet bare of proper shoes, had cracked something in his carefully maintained distance. She was still trembling as he helped her up. "Thank you," she managed, her voice shaky. She tried to stand on her own, then winced as her injured knee bore her weight. He steadied her immediately, his hand firm at her elbow. "You need to sit," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. He helped her into his waiting carriage, which caused a small scandal among the passers-by, a noblewoman entering a stranger's carriage without a chaperone. But Alaric gave them all a look that discouraged further commentary, and they turned away. Inside the carriage, with the door closed and the horses moving slowly through London's afternoon traffic, he could finally assess the damage. Her right knee was scraped and bleeding. Her hands were raw from hitting the pavement. A bruise was already forming on her left cheekbone. But her eyes were sharp and aware, burning with something that wasn't pain, but rather a kind of fierce, desperate emotion. "My name is Lord Alaric Blackwood," he said, offering her a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "Duke of Ashbourne. And you are?" "Elara," she said, pressing the handkerchief to her bleeding hands. "Elara Hartwick. You were chasing that carriage with considerable determination, Miss Hartwick. I'm inclined to assume there was a reason beyond simple athleticism." He meant it as a gentle question, an opening for her to share if she wished. What he got instead was an outpouring. The words came quickly, tumbling over each other. The story of her sister, the theft, the dress that was supposed to be hers for the Grand Patron's gala. She told him about her work, about the dress she'd created, about the way Serafina had walked into her workshop and taken it. And Alaric found himself listening, really listening, not with the polite attention he afforded society matrons and titled families, but with genuine, consuming interest. She spoke about her dress the way other women spoke about love, the way she described the gold cording, the draping of the skirt, the vision she'd had for how it would move. It was the language of art, of obsession, of talent. "It was yours," she said, and her hands clenched into fists, then unclenched as the pain reminded her of her injuries. "I created it. Every stitch was mine. Every design choice was mine. And she just walked in and took it." "To sell," Alaric said, understanding the full scope of the offence. "Yes, to a woman named Mrs. Edith Pembroke, for money." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Alaric realised it wasn't just the dress being stolen that had broken her. It was the reduction of her art to a transaction. It was the theft of her creation being treated as if it had no more value than a bolt of fabric. He understood then why she had run into the street. They rode in silence for a moment. The carriage moved through London's streets, carrying them toward his townhouse in Belgrave Square. "You created that dress," Alaric said finally, "which means you can create another one." Elara looked at him as if he'd suggested she fly to the moon. "Not in time for the gala," she said. "The event is in 2 weeks. I only finished the design 3 months ago, and that was after months of planning. The gala," she shook her head. "The gala was my opportunity. My sister just ensured it would never happen." Alaric considered this. He considered the woman in front of him, bruised and shaken, and somehow still radiating a fierce, unquenchable passion. He considered her talent, which was evident in every word she spoke about her craft. He considered the injustice of her sister's theft, and the way the world would simply let that injustice stand. And then he made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. "I'm holding a ball," he said, "at my estate, 4 weeks from now. It will be small, exclusive, and carefully curated. The most influential people in London will attend." Elara stared at him. "I need a gown," he continued. "Not for myself, for my aunt, Lady Beatrice. She's reclusive, rarely appears in society, but I want her to attend my ball, and I want her to be unforgettable when she does. I'm willing to commission a dress from you on one condition." "What condition?" Elara's voice was barely a whisper. "That you create something magnificent," Alaric said simply. "That you pour the same passion I see in your eyes into this commission. That you prove to yourself and to society that your talent is undeniable, and that you attend the ball as my guest, wearing a dress of your own design, your own triumph." Elara's hands were shaking again, but not from pain this time. 1 month, she said quietly. 1 month, Alaric confirmed. "I'll arrange for a stipend to cover the finest fabrics. My steward will provide access to any merchant you require. And if you need anything at all, you have only to ask." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but also caution. Also the wariness of someone who has learned not to trust in rescue. "Why?" she asked finally. "Because," Alaric said, and the truth of it surprised even him, "I believe in art, and I believe in talent, and I refuse to let either be diminished by the pettiness of others." Her mother was waiting in the drawing room when Elara returned to the townhouse, not waiting in the casual sense, positioned, ready, armed with the kind of maternal concern that was actually maternal fury disguised as care. "Elara," her mother said, standing as Elara entered, her eyes taking in the scraped hands, the torn hem, the general state of disarray. "Where have you been? And what in God's name has happened to you?" The questions came rapidly, overlapping, not really waiting for answers. Elara's mother, Lady Hartwick, was a woman of considerable social standing and considerably less understanding. She had married for position, produced 2 daughters for position, and spent her entire life ensuring that everything about her family reflected the position she had married into. Elara's current appearance reflected nothing but scandal. "I was chased by a horse," Elara said, which was technically true, if incomplete. "I fell. A gentleman helped me up." "A gentleman?" Her mother's expression shifted from concern to calculation. "Which gentleman?" "Lord Alaric Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne." The drawing room seemed to hold its breath. The Blackwood family had old money, enormous estates, considerable political influence. A duke, a single duke. Elara could see her mother's mind working through the possibilities, rearranging the furniture of her expectations. "He brought you home," her mother said, not a question. "He brought me to his townhouse, where I could clean my wounds, and then he brought me here." "And what did he want?" her mother asked sharply. "What was the purpose of his charity?" Elara took a breath. "He's commissioning a dress. For his aunt, Lady Beatrice. For a ball he's hosting in 4 weeks. He wants me to design and create it. The silence that followed was profound. You, her mother said finally. He hired you to make a dress. To create a dress, Elara corrected. I'm not a seamstress for hire, mother. You are a daughter of this family, her mother interrupted. You are supposed to be focusing on making a suitable marriage, not on needlework. The Duke is single. The Duke is of considerable standing. And you spend an afternoon in his carriage and accept a commission from him. He recognized my talent, Elara said quietly. He recognized an opportunity, her mother said, but her voice had shifted. It was sharper now, more calculating. Nevertheless, if a duke has shown interest, we must be careful. We must be strategic. If he's commissioning a dress from you, he's clearly viewing you as an artisan, not as a potential wife. We need to change that perception. I don't want to change that perception, Elara said. I want to create the dress. Her mother's eyes narrowed. Serafina. What about Serafina? Where is she? Why hasn't she come to greet you? Elara realized in that moment that her mother didn't know. Serafina hadn't confessed. The dress hadn't been mentioned. The theft was, at least for now, still a secret. Serafina is out, Elara said carefully. I'm going to my atelier now. I need to begin sketching. She left before her mother could ask more questions. The atelier was exactly as she'd left it. The dress on the mannequin still incomplete. The threads scattered on her work table. The morning's work interrupted by theft and revelation. Elara cleaned her hands as best she could, wrapped the worst of the scrapes, and sat down at her table with fresh paper and a pencil. 1 month, 4 weeks, to create something magnificent for a woman she'd never met, for a ball that would change everything. She drew. The pencil moved across the paper with the same fluidity as her needle moved through fabric. The vision came not from thinking, but from somewhere deeper, from the place where her hands knew things her mind hadn't yet articulated. Lady Beatrice was reclusive. The Duke had said that, which meant she had chosen solitude for a reason, which meant the dress needed to be something that would feel like a homecoming, not a costume, something that honored her choice while also celebrating her presence. The design emerged. Deep jewel tones, perhaps a rich burgundy or a midnight blue. Not gold. Elara had done gold. This needed something different. Silver, perhaps, or bronze. Something that caught the light but didn't demand it. Something elegant and understated, while being unmistakably powerful. The silhouette would be clean, simple, the kind of dress that looked effortless but required absolute precision to create, the kind of dress that whispered rather than shouted. She sketched until her hands ached, until the light began to fade from the windows, until the vision was on paper, as clearly as it lived in her mind. When she finally set down her pencil, it was dark outside, and she was smiling. Over the next week, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, Serafina's theft became known. Mrs. Edith Pembroke arrived in London, and her daughter wore Elara's dress to an afternoon tea. Within hours, the story was all over society. The Hartwick girl's dress, stolen by the younger sister, sold to an American heiress without her knowledge. Serafina's reputation, already precarious, was destroyed. Their mother was furious, not with Serafina for the theft, but with Elara for letting the scandal become public. The family name had been touched by something unseemly. This was Elara's fault for being brilliant. This was Elara's fault for being talented. This was Elara's fault for attracting attention that made her family uncomfortable. You're an embarrassment, her mother told her coldly. Your only path to redemption is to marry well and do it quickly. The Duke will not look at you now. No one will look at you now. Elara simply returned to her atelier and kept working. Second, the Duke's steward appeared at the townhouse with a stipend and a letter of introduction to the finest fabric merchants in London. The amount was extraordinarily generous, more than enough for the finest materials, with considerable funds remaining. Third, 4 young men from respectable families came to call, obviously sent by their mothers to assess the availability of a talented but now scandalous girl. Elara received them politely and then turned them all down. I'm not interested in marriage, she told each one, watching their confusion and disappointment. But the scandal, one of them began, is not my problem, Elara finished. A marriage certainly won't solve it. What will solve it is creating something so undeniably magnificent that everyone will forget to whisper about the scandal and start whispering about the talent instead. The young men left. Her mother despaired, but Elara kept working. The fabric arrived, the deepest midnight blue silk she'd ever seen. So dark it looked almost black in certain lights. Bronze threading, the finest underline, everything needed for a masterpiece. She pinned the pattern to the fabric. She began to cut with absolute precision. Each line measured, each angle calculated. The waste of fabric would be minimal. Every inch would be honored in the design. Her hands moved with the surety of someone who had been born for exactly this moment. 1 month, the Duke had said. She would give him 4 weeks of genius. Time moved differently in the atelier. In the outside world, days passed in the conventional way, morning to evening, one sunrise following another. But at her work table, surrounded by fabric and thread, and the endless possibilities of creation, Elara existed in a state outside of ordinary time. She would begin work at dawn and look up to find the sun had already set. She would start sketching a detail and suddenly realize an entire week had passed. The dress consumed her in the way that only obsession can. The bodice was completed first, a marvel of precision engineering. The midnight blue silk was cut in such a way that it created a perfect silhouette, the bronze threading creating subtle lines that guided the eye without shouting for attention. The neckline was low but not scandalous, the waist fitted to impossible perfection, the shoulders emphasizing the natural grace of a woman's frame. It was beautiful, it was perfect, it was not yet complete. The skirt was the problem. Elara had envisioned it in her mind with absolute clarity, a series of controlled pleats that would create movement and drama while maintaining the clean, understated elegance of the overall design. The pleats would be deep enough to allow for graceful movement, but structured enough that they would hold their shape, even as Lady Beatrice moved through a ballroom. It should have been simple. It should have been straightforward. It was neither. She had tried 17 different approaches, 17 different structures, 17 different calculations, 17 different ways of pleating and stitching, and arranging the fabric to achieve the vision in her mind. And none of them worked. The pleats would fall wrong. The draping would twist. The structure would hold for an hour and then collapse. The bronze threading would catch wrong, creating visual lines that disrupted the design rather than enhancing it. 3 weeks into the commission, and she was failing. It was the kind of failure that kept her awake at night. Not the failure of exhaustion, though that was certainly present, but the deeper failure, the failure of a vision that couldn't quite be executed, the failure of hands that, for once, couldn't quite do what the mind demanded. She stood in front of the dress, or rather, the partially completed dress, on the morning of the 22nd day, and felt something dangerously close to despair. The bodice hung perfectly from the dress form. The bronze threading caught the light. The midnight blue was regal and powerful, and exactly what she'd imagined. But the skirt was a disaster of pins and seams and failed attempts. Fabric that should have been beautiful was bunched and twisted. The structure was visible when it should have been invisible. The whole piece looked incomplete because it was incomplete, and Elara had no idea how to complete it. She had run out of ideas. She sat down at her work table and put her head in her hands and allowed herself, for the first time since the theft, to contemplate failure. What if Serafina had been right? What if Elara's talent had limits? What if she had finally encountered something that exceeded her abilities? What if she couldn't finish the dress? The Duke arrived unannounced on the afternoon of the 24th day. Elara's lady's maid, Rose, came to fetch her from the atelier with news that Lord Alaric Blackwood was requesting an audience. Elara's heart sank. She hadn't wanted him to see the dress while it was in this state. She had wanted him to see it only when it was perfect, when every stitch was exactly as envisioned, when the entire vision had been realized. She found him in the drawing room, examining one of her sketches that she'd left on the side table. He looked up as she entered, and his expression shifted immediately. "You're struggling," he said. "Not a question. How did you—" "I came to check on your progress," Alaric said. "I brought you some additional bronze threading. I found a merchant with a particularly fine weight that I thought might interest you, but I can see it's more than supplies you need." He set down the sketch. "May I see the dress?" Elara wanted to say no. She wanted to send him away and keep working in secret until she either succeeded or failed completely. But there was something in his expression, not judgment, but genuine interest, that made her take him to the atelier. She showed him the bodice first, and she saw his eyes light up as he examined the construction, the way the bronze threading created subtle visual guides, the precision of the stitching. Then she showed him the skirt. He was quiet for a long moment. "The vision is here," he said finally, moving closer to examine the structure. "I can see exactly what you want the skirt to do, but the mechanics, you're fighting the fabric. Look," he pointed to one of her failed attempts. "You're trying to force the pleats to maintain shape through stitching alone. You're using tension when you should be using structure." Elara bristled immediately. This was her domain. This was her expertise. "I know what I'm doing," she said coldly. "I'm sure you do," Alaric said, and his tone was so genuinely apologetic that her anger deflated slightly. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." He stepped back, his hands raised. "I apologize for overstepping. It's not my place." He moved to leave, and Elara felt something in her chest twist. "Wait, what were you going to say? About the structure?" Alaric turned back, clearly hesitant. "I spent years studying architecture," he said quietly. "Before an injury forced me to stop actively designing buildings, I spent every moment I had learning about how structures hold their shape, how weight is distributed, how materials resist or yield to force." He approached the dress again, but this time he was asking permission with his eyes. She nodded. "The pleats need an internal structure," he said, examining the bodice where it met the skirt. "Not stitching to hold them. That's what's failing. A foundation. Something underneath that holds the shape while the fabric drapes naturally over it. It's what architects do with walls. We use internal support that the eye never sees, but the structure depends on completely." Elara felt something click in her mind. "A bone structure," she said slowly, "inside the hem, running along the pleat line." "Precisely," Alaric said. "The bronze threading could create the visual line along the pleats, but underneath, you'd have something that holds everything in place. The fabric would be beautiful and free, but the structure underneath would be absolute." Elara was already moving toward her supplies, her mind racing through the possibilities. "The weight distribution," she murmured. "If I use the right material, something that won't be visible but will hold firm." "Exactly," Alaric said, and he was smiling now. "You have the vision, you have the skill. You just needed to think like an engineer for a moment." She looked up at him, and something shifted between them, something that went beyond admiration for the dress or gratitude for his help. It was the recognition of two people who understood, in their very different ways, what it meant to create something that worked, that was both beautiful and functional, that honored both art and precision. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for reminding me that art requires the same respect for structure that architecture does." The bone structure, delicate strips of the finest buckram, carefully shaped to follow the pleat lines, transformed the dress from impossible to inevitable. Elara worked through the night that Alaric had left, implementing the solution he had suggested. It took hours to stitch the buckram in place, precisely enough that it would be completely invisible beneath the silk, yet strong enough to hold the pleat structure perfectly. But as she worked, she understood what he had meant about invisible architecture. The pleats held their shape not through force but through support. The fabric draped naturally, but underneath, everything was exactly where it needed to be. By dawn, one pleat was complete. She studied it in the early morning light and felt something like triumph. This was the answer. This was how to make the vision real. She had 6 days. Elara stopped sleeping. She stopped eating anything more than bread and cheese that Rose left for her. She stopped acknowledging the outside world entirely. The dress became her entire existence. Every moment, every thought, every breath dedicated to completing what she had promised. The second pleat took slightly less time than the first. The third, less time than the second. By the third day, she had completed 6 pleats. By the fourth day, she had completed 12. The mathematical precision of the work was both meditative and exhilarating. The pleats began to create the vision she'd held in her mind, a series of controlled folds that caught and released the light that allowed for movement while maintaining absolute control. The bronze threading required the most delicate work of all. Each line had to be stitched by hand, following the exact path Elara had originally envisioned. It was the kind of work that could take weeks with proper rest and care. But with Elara's fevered intensity and absolute focus, it took 4 days. By the morning of the 7th day, the day of the ball, the dress was complete. Elara stood before it on the dress form in her atelier, and for the first time since the theft, since the fall, since the commission, she saw the entire vision realized exactly as it had lived in her mind. The midnight blue silk caught the light and released it like a promise. The bronze threading created subtle visual lines that guided the eye without dominating it. The bodice was perfect, regal and powerful and utterly sophisticated. And the skirt moved with a fluidity that suggested freedom, while the internal structure created an absolute architectural perfection. This was not just a dress. This was a masterpiece. Elara sank into the chair at her work table and cried, not from sadness or exhaustion, but from the overwhelming relief of completion. She had done it. Against all odds, against the theft, against her mother's disapproval, against her own moments of doubt, she had created something magnificent. The ball was held at the Duke's country estate, approximately 2 hours from London. Elara had never been to anything so grand. The estate itself was a palace, soaring ceilings, endless rooms, gardens that seemed to stretch into infinity. The ballroom alone was larger than her family's entire townhouse. The guest list was as Alaric had promised, small, exclusive, carefully curated. Perhaps 200 people, the most influential families in London, the most important patrons of the arts, the most powerful people in society. And in the centre of it all was Lady Beatrice. The Duke's aunt was exactly as Elara had sensed she should be, a woman of a certain age who had chosen solitude, but whose solitude spoke of dignity rather than withdrawal. She was beautiful, not because of conventional prettiness, but because of the way she carried herself, with absolute confidence and complete indifference to what anyone else thought. When Alaric led her into the ballroom wearing Elara's dress, the entire room seemed to pause. The midnight blue was striking, the bronze threading caught the candlelight, but what was truly striking was the way the dress seemed to celebrate Lady Beatrice's choice to be exactly who she was. She looked regal. She looked powerful. She looked like a woman who had never compromised herself for anyone. She looked unforgettable. Elara attended on Alaric's arm, wearing her own creation, a simpler version of the design, elegant and understated, beautiful in its restraint. As they moved through the ballroom, she could feel the eyes of society following them. The scandal of the theft had not been forgotten. The gossip about her and the Duke had not faded. But in this moment, seeing her dress on Lady Beatrice, seeing the way it transformed the room, the way it made people stop and simply stare in admiration, Elara realized that none of that mattered. Her talent was undeniable, and that was enough. Alaric led her to the side of the ballroom where they could see the entire room spread out before them. "She looks magnificent," he said, watching his aunt move through the crowd with regal dignity. "The dress looks magnificent," Elara corrected. "The dress is magnificent, Alaric, because you made it magnificent. But Lady Beatrice looks magnificent because she is being celebrated for exactly who she is. That's what you did, Elara. You created something that honors her, that celebrates her, that suggests she is worthy of admiration, not because she conformed to society's expectations, but because she refused to." Elara looked up at him, and she saw something in his expression that went beyond admiration for her work. She saw a man who had come to respect her, not just as an artisan, but as a person, a woman who had suffered betrayal and chosen creation over bitterness, who had refused marriage offers and chosen her art, who had faced scandal and answered with genius. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing in me. I believed in your talent from the moment I saw you chase your sister's carriage into the street," Alaric said. "But what I've come to believe in over these past weeks is you, your courage, your refusal to be diminished, your absolute commitment to your vision." He took her hand, and the gesture was neither improper nor timid. It was a simple, clear claim of connection. "When this ball is over," he said, "we need to talk about something that has nothing to do with dresses." The toast came later in the evening, when the guests had relaxed into the champagne and the music, and the general pleasure of being present at something extraordinary. Alaric stood and raised his glass, and the ballroom quieted immediately. This was what happened when a duke spoke at his own ball. The world bent itself toward listening. "I want to speak," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silence. "About art, about talent, about what happens when someone encounters true genius and chooses, in that moment, to step aside and let the genius shine, rather than attempting to diminish it." He paused, and his eyes found Elara in the crowd. "3 weeks ago, I encountered a woman in the street in the most unfortunate of circumstances. She had suffered a loss. Something precious had been taken from her, without her consent. I offered a commission in response, not as charity, but because I recognized in that woman something rare, the kind of talent that is not learned, but born, the kind of talent that when you see it, you understand you are in the presence of something genuinely uncommon." The ballroom was utterly still. "I commissioned the dress you see tonight, worn by my beloved Aunt Lady Beatrice, from a woman whose name was unknown to society until very recently. Her name is Elara Hartwick, and I am delighted to tell you that her talent is entirely undeniable." He gestured toward Lady Beatrice, who stood with absolute grace and dignity, the midnight blue dress creating an almost ethereal effect as she turned slowly so that everyone could see the full beauty of the design. "What I'm less delighted to tell you," Alaric continued, his voice shifting to something sharper, "is that the dress Elara originally created for her own attendance at another recent event was stolen from, sold by her own sister, a woman named Serafina Hartwick, to another buyer for a pittance, without Elara's knowledge or consent." A collective gasp moved through the ballroom. From across the room, Elara could see Mrs. Edith Pembroke, the American woman who had purchased the stolen dress, suddenly straighten in her chair. "Mrs. Pembroke," Alaric said, as if addressing her directly, "I am speaking to you now. You purchased a dress in good faith, believing it was legitimately for sale. I do not blame you. However, the dress was stolen property, and the original creator deserves to have her work recognized." He turned his attention back to the room at large. "I have already compensated Mrs. Pembroke for the return of the dress to its rightful creator," he continued. "But I want society to understand something clearly. Talent of the caliber you see represented in this room does not come from proper families or good breeding or the correct connections. It comes from hands that know how to create beauty, from minds that can envision something extraordinary, from hearts that refuse to be diminished by theft or scandal or the casual cruelty of jealousy." He raised his glass higher. "I want to propose a toast to Elara Hartwick, to her talent, to her courage, to her refusal to be destroyed by what was taken from her, and to the promise that, from this moment forward, society will recognize her not as a scandal, but as the genius she undeniably is." Every single person in the ballroom raised their glass. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Within the hour, women who had previously scorned Elara were approaching her with compliments. Men who had been sent to assess her eligibility were suddenly asking if she would consider commissions. Society's judgment, which had been so swift in its condemnation, shifted with equal speed to admiration. But there was something else too. Serafina's reputation, which had been fragile before, shattered completely. The story of how she had stolen her sister's dress, sold it for money, and then tried to profit from the association was too juicy for society to ignore. Within hours of the toast, she became persona non grata. Invitations were withdrawn. Doors were closed. Her prospects for marriage, already diminished, became impossible. She left London 3 days later, under the protection of a distant aunt, her dreams of a respectable future effectively destroyed by her own jealousy. But Elara didn't think about Serafina, as she accepted congratulations and discussed future commissions with some of London's most powerful women. She thought only about the man who had chosen, in that moment at the ball, to use his position and his voice and his considerable influence not for himself, but for her. Later that evening, when the ball was ending and the guests were departing, Alaric found her alone in the garden. "You kept your promise. You gave me vindication." "I did nothing," he replied. "Your dress gave you vindication. I simply made certain that the world saw it." He took her hand in the moonlight, and this time it was not a casual gesture of connection. It was a claim, a promise, an intention. "I told you there was something we needed to discuss," he said quietly. "Something that has nothing to do with dresses." Vindication, Elara quickly learned, came with its own complications. The story of how the Duke had commissioned a dress from an unknown artisan, how he had spent time in her workshop, how he had taken her to his carriage in the street, how he had devoted considerable effort and resources to ensuring her triumph at his ball. Society noticed, and society, being what it was, began to whisper. It started innocuously enough. Comments about how the Duke was very invested in the success of the Hartwick girl. Observations about how frequently he was seen at her family's home. Speculation about whether the admiration he expressed for her talent might be obscuring other motivations entirely. Within a week, the whispers had evolved into something more pointed. "They say the Duke is keeping her," one woman told another, loud enough for Elara to hear at a tea she hadn't wanted to attend. "A mistress? Quite possibly. Why else would he be so involved in her career?" "It's a scandal," another agreed. "The girl goes from disgraced seamstress to the Duke's paramour, and he behaves as though it's perfectly respectable because she designs his aunt's dress." Elara tried to ignore it. She focused on the commissions that were pouring in. Every woman of importance in London wanting a dress from the girl who had impressed a duke. She worked 16 hours a day, her hands moving with the surety of someone who had found her calling. But the gossip didn't stop. If anything, it grew. And then something worse happened. The Duke's family, it emerged, had already made plans for his marriage. Alaric was engaged, or nearly engaged, to the daughter of one of England's oldest families. The arrangement had been in discussion for months, a union that would solidify the Blackwood family's political position and ensure continuity of the line. The wedding was to be announced within weeks. Elara found out through gossip, not through Alaric. She was in her atelier, working on a commission for the Duchess of Somerset, when Rose came in with tea, an awkward concern. "Have you heard?" Rose asked gently. Elara had. Of course she had. The entire of London seemed to have heard. The only person who hadn't mentioned it to her was Alaric himself. She set down her needle with care, trying not to let her hands shake. "It's society talk," Rose said, trying to comfort her. "Just gossip. You know how they are." But Elara did know how society worked. She knew that the Duke, for all his progressive views and his defense of her talent, was still bound by duty, still obligated to my family, still expected to make the match that benefited the Blackwood name and fortune. The dress she was creating for the Duchess of Somerset suddenly felt heavier. The thread seemed to resist. The fabric wouldn't cooperate. For the first time since the theft, Elara felt like she was drowning. Alaric came to the atelier 3 days later. He arrived without warning in the afternoon when Elara was alone, working on a particularly difficult commission, a gown that required the kind of precision and focus that could push everything else away. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and the expression on his face told her that he knew what she had heard. "I wanted to explain," he said immediately. "You're engaged," Elara said flatly, returning her attention to her work. "Congratulations. That's a good match, I'm sure. Your family must be pleased." "Elara, you should probably go," she said, not looking at her. "I have work to do, and people are talking. Your engagement is barely announced. It wouldn't be appropriate for you to be spending time here." "I don't care what people are talking about," Alaric said, and there was an edge of desperation in his voice that she'd never heard before. "And I am not going to marry her. I came here to tell you that directly." Elara's hands stilled on the fabric. "My family arranged the engagement without consulting me," Alaric continued. "They told me it was happening. They didn't ask. They decided it was necessary and assumed I would accept. But I'm not going to accept it. I'm going to break the engagement, and then I'm going to do something that will probably further scandalize both our names." "Alaric, you can't—" "I can," he interrupted. "And I'm going to. Because I love you. Not your talent, though I absolutely admire that. Not your courage, though I absolutely respect that. I love you. And I have since that first moment in the street when you fell. And I realized that the woman whose life I was catching was someone I wanted to know for the rest of my life. The engagement scandal was spectacular. The Duke of Ashbourne breaking his commitment to one of England's oldest families, citing personal reasons and a sudden understanding of what truly mattered. The girl he chose instead, a seamstress from a disgraced family, of no particular lineage and no particular fortune. Society was absolutely scandalized. Alaric's family was furious. Elara's mother despaired. The newspapers dedicated entire columns to the shocking turn of events. Gossip columnists speculated endlessly about the nature of the Duke's obsession with the Hartwick, Some suggested he had lost his mind. Others suggested she had bewitched him. A few, to their credit, simply said, perhaps he is in love. Neither Alaric nor Elara cared what society said. He proposed to her in her atelier, not with any fanfare or drama, but simply by asking her directly if she would marry him. Yes, she said, without hesitation, without doubt, without the slightest need for time to consider. They were married quietly, in a small church, with only a handful of witnesses present. No grand society event, no elaborate ceremony. Just two people who had recognized something rare in each other. Not rescue, not admiration, but genuine partnership between two people who understood what it meant to create something beautiful. Elara wore a dress of her own design, elegant, understated, perfect. It was midnight blue, like the dress that had started everything, but simpler, cleaner. A dress that said, I am exactly who I am, and I am enough. Alaric wore formal black, and when he looked at her standing in front of the vicar, his expression was one of pure, unconditional joy. I do, she said, when the moment came. I do, he said, and meant it with his entire being. In the months that followed, the scandal gradually faded. Society began to understand that the Duke was not insane, merely in love. Elara's talent became so undeniable that her lack of proper lineage became less important than her undeniable genius. The couple settled into a life that was, by all accounts, extraordinarily happy. But it was not a life of luxury and status in the traditional sense. Instead, Alaric and Elara transformed one of the townhouses in his London properties into something unprecedented. A working atelier studio where Elara created dresses and Alaric studied the architectural principles that made beautiful things possible. Together, they developed a method, combining her artistic vision with his structural knowledge, that created pieces that were both stunningly beautiful and architecturally perfect. Word spread. Soon, women from across Europe were commissioning dresses from Elara Hartwick, now the Duchess of Ashbourne. Her name became synonymous with genius. Her creations became objects of desire and admiration. But more importantly, she was happy. She worked at what she loved, alongside a man who understood that work. She had found respect not through marriage to a powerful man, but through the man she married, respecting her power. She had gained a career and a love that were equally real, equally important, and equally essential to who she was. One evening, nearly a year after they met in the street, Elara stood in her atelier and looked around at the evidence of everything she had created. Dozens of commissions completed, hundreds of sketches, thread and fabric, and the visual representation of pure genius. And then she looked at Alaric, who was studying an architectural blueprint while sitting in the chair where she'd wept over failed attempts at the Duchess's dress. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Choosing me over the engagement, over your family's expectations? He looked up, and his expression was one of absolute certainty. Never, he said simply. How could I regret choosing the woman I love? How could I regret choosing truth over expectation? How could I regret becoming someone better because of the partnership we share? He stood and crossed the atelier to where she stood. My family has recovered, he continued. Society has accepted her. But none of that would matter if I wasn't standing here, in this atelier that smells of fabric and possibility, with the woman who changed my life. That matters. Everything else is secondary to that. Elara smiled and took his hand. She had lost a dress to her sister's jealousy. In exchange, she had gained a career, a love, and a partnership that honored every part of who she was. She had been rejected by society. Now, society admired her. But most importantly, she had been seen, truly seen, and that made everything else possible. Years later, when Elara was considered one of the finest designers in all of Europe, people would ask her the same question repeatedly. How did you survive the theft? How did you overcome the scandal? How did you become what you are? She never told them the answer they wanted to hear. She didn't tell them that love saved her, or that a duke's intervention made everything possible, or that she was somehow specially blessed. Those things were true, but they weren't the answer. The real answer was simpler. She refused to let what was taken from her define her future. When Serafina stole the sapphire dress, she stole a creation, but she couldn't steal Elara's ability to create. She took fabric and thread, and a month of work, but she couldn't take the vision that lived in Elara's mind. She could take the past, but she couldn't dictate the future. And Elara, in the aftermath of theft and scandal and humiliation, had chosen to use that truth. She had chosen to create something new, something better, something that would become the foundation for everything that came after. The Duchess's dress had been the beginning, but it wasn't the end. Elara continued to create, year after year, decade after decade. She trained young women who wanted to learn the craft. She developed new techniques. She collaborated with Alaric on pieces that combined art and engineering in ways that had never been attempted before. Their partnership became legendary, not because he had saved her, but because they saved each other. He gave her a stage when she had none. She gave him a purpose beyond the obligations of his title. Together, they created beauty that the world recognized and celebrated. The atelier in London became a destination. Women from every corner of the world came to commission dresses from Elara Hartwick. Actresses wore her designs on the stage. Royalty wore her designs to state functions. Critics called her a genius. But what Elara was most proud of wasn't the fame, or the commissions, or the way her name became synonymous with excellence. What she was most proud of was the young women she trained. The girls from humble backgrounds who discovered they had talent and learned that talent could be their salvation. The women who came to her, broken by circumstances or loss or family cruelty, and left knowing that their hands could create something magnificent. She taught them that a stolen dress wouldn't define them, that scandal could be survived, that the world's judgment could be transformed through the undeniable proof of genius. She taught them that love, real love, true partnership, meant being seen for exactly who you were, not in spite of your flaws, but including them, embracing them, respecting them as the cost of being someone real and true. On a winter afternoon, nearly 30 years after she had fallen in the street chasing her sister's carriage, Elara stood in her atelier with Alaric. They were older now, their hands showing the signs of decades of work. The atelier was quieter than it used to be. They were training younger designers now, letting them take on more of the work. But the work continued. The creation continued. The beauty continued. "Do you ever think about that day?" Alaric asked, taking her hand. "When you fell, and I stopped my carriage." "Every day," Elara said. "I think about how angry I was, how desperate, how certain that everything was ruined. And now I think about how grateful I am," she said simply. "Not that you rescued me, but that you saw me, truly saw me, and believed in what I could become." He smiled and kissed her hand, and they stood together in the atelier that had been the foundation of everything, surrounded by the proof of talent, the evidence of genius, the legacy of a woman who had refused to be diminished by theft or scandal, and had instead created something that would outlast them both.